Good afternoon, everybody. Hello and welcome to everybody. There are people here who are familiar with the space and our parish, if you are people who worship here regularly or occasionally, and there are people who are visitors. So I will just explain a couple of things also about the building while I'm here. For those who don't know me, my name is Nick Denny Demetrio. I'm the parish priest for St. David's Anglican Church here in Chelmer. I said I'd make a few comments about the building. I don't need to say a whole lot, but for anybody who needs a bathroom, there is a toilet at the back end, just to the side, at the back end of the church. There are two that are just outside the door. They're all on a flat level, all accessible. I don't think I need to say anything else about that other than that tea and coffee are served afterwards, and everybody is welcome to stay for that. Probably many of you who are here today have already received some of the information that we put out when we were already planning to invite Gavin Scott to come and give this talk. But just aware that there might be a few who have not, I will make a few particular comments, partly to introduce Gavin to you, and also just to explain a few things about what Gavin is doing. I've had the privilege already of seeing Gavin's presentation. He has made it, I'm not sure where all, but at a number of places, and I had the privilege of being invited to a Probus club that meets at one of the AVO retirement villages where he gave his presentation. It is the same presentation throughout, and Gavin will tell us more as he goes through. But as we have made very clear, Gavin is not here to tell anybody how to vote. The point of this is to give a very clear line of history in regards to legal matters, particularly as they affect Aboriginal people in this country from colonial times and federation and so on. It's also to talk very clearly from a legal perspective of what the proposed voice to Parliament is and what it is not. What enables Gavin to be able to do so with such authority? In addition to being a member of our parish, which is why many of us here will be familiar with Gavin, Gavin is a partner at Norton Rose Fulbright, a global law firm. He's one of Australia's leading native title and Aboriginal cultural heritage lawyers. His work entails helping his clients develop projects and forming strong and sustainable relationships with First Nations communities. Over the past 20 years, this has included coal and gas projects, solar and wind farms, rail and power, and hydrogen projects. He also sits on the Queensland Advisory Board of the Red Cross, is a keen rugby supporter, loves cooking, and is a father to twin 18-year-old boys and husband to Angela. So it's a privilege to have Gavin speak to us today, and there will be time for people to ask questions afterwards. And then also, as we mingle after tea, if people wish to engage Gavin further, you'd be welcome to do that. Thank you, Gavin.
Thanks, Nick. Just checking the sound. Is that clear at the back? Good-o? Thank you for the invitation. Just to set some scene, I have had the privilege of working in this area for the past 20 years. That's taken me to see many of the Aboriginal communities around Australia, currently working in matters in the Northern Territory, West Australia, doing a lot of renewable projects in Queensland. Also have run a number of quite high profile court cases in the native title space, including up to the High Court of Australia. I wanted to take people on a bit of a journey today because context is everything with these sorts of matters. So we're going to do a bit of a grade 10 history lesson as well before we get to the actual constitutional law bit. We're going to sort of go through the springboard of what the voice is and then try to sort of put some facts out there. But I think the most important part is just understanding how we sit here as a nation, firstly. And so what I always like to do when I open a meeting like this is to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we are. So this is in Turrbal and Yagara country. If you may have come up from north and see Stradey Island, you might be in Quandamooka or Kabi Kabi country, or if you're from out at Ipswich Way, then you're probably living on Yugara and Agarapul country. So just interesting to know that there are multiple Aboriginal nations even in and around our own southeast Queensland. Let's go on a higher level now, and I'm just going to take you on a little historical journey in case people are thinking, why are we talking about this now? Why is it just so sudden that we're talking about some sort of change to the Constitution to recognise First Nations groups? And what I want to try to let you know is that this is just a continuing narrative from at least the 50s and certainly at least the 80s. Now, I've got a couple of dates up there. If you can't read that, I'll read them through for you. And I'll take a bit of this from a legal perspective as well, because that's what this whole referendum is about. It's about changing the Constitution, which is the fundamental legal basis of the way the Commonwealth Government governs our country. So in 1788, we had people stick flags down Sydney Way in La Perouse. And what happened there, in addition to forming the colony of New South Wales, is we inherited the common law of the United Kingdom. So there was a system of law. There were people here before that flag was placed into the ground. But as colonisation happened across the world, when a country colonised and settled another country, you inherited their system of law. So the common law of the United Kingdom, which is the basis of the Westminster system and all of the laws that you are very familiar with, was inherited. Now, at that stage, it was also then considered that this was a land that belonged to no one. So the Latin phrase for that was terra nullius, and I'll come back to that when we get to Mabo. And from colonisation all the way through, you then had the spread of the English and now the colonial common law throughout the country. So the laws that we made about land tenure, about governments, about policing, about health and the like. There was obviously a disjunct there because there were Aboriginal people living here when the country was colonised. And for over 150 years, many Aboriginal groups, many Aboriginal people tried to say, look, we were here first and we'd like some recognition of those rights. So I'm just going to take you through a little history lesson to show that what we're asked to do in October is really a continuing narrative of Aboriginal communities seeking to have some of their rights of being the First Nations here recognised. And many of you will be familiar with these sorts of moments in history. The one I'd like to start with is in the Northern Territory in the 60s, which was the Yirrkala Bark Petition. That's the Yolngu people up in East Arnhem Land were driven off their land because bauxite was found up there. Nabalco were granted mining leases, that's now Rio Tinto. And the Yolngu people wrote these beautiful bark petitions. It looks like that on the right. That's currently hanging in the museum in Canberra, which basically petitioned the Parliament in Canberra to say, look, we were here before you, we've been driven off our land, but it's not recognised. Surely there's something that the Commonwealth Government can do to recognise the pre-existing rights that we had. And so they wrote this in English, they wrote it in Yolngu language, and there was a couple of these bark petitions that went to the Commonwealth Parliament, and the parliamentarians at the time said, well, that's very interesting, but we have no powers to do anything of that nature. In fact, we can't even make laws for Aboriginal people because it's specifically in the Constitution that we have no powers to make any laws for Aboriginal people. We can't count you in the census, so that failed. But that was the first time we saw Aboriginal groups say, we'd really like to be recognised in some way. And now that's just a nice moment of history. 60s was obviously quite a Reformation era. Also in Northern Territory, there were large pastoral stations granted, often to the landed gentry of the United Kingdom. And one in Gurindji land, the Northern Territory, a very large pastoral station called Wave Hill, which employed over 200 or 300 Aboriginal people who were of that area anyway. Often it was the only way they could go back to their home countries by working as labourers and stockmen and the like. But they weren't paid very well wages, if anything. Their wages were garnished and the like. And a strike had happened. The very first time, a whole heap of Aboriginal people thought, no, this is not good enough. This is our land. It's been granted to Lord whoever in the United Kingdom. We're not being treated well. We're going to walk off. And so there's a very famous movement of the Wave Hill walk-off. which was led by one Vincent Lingari, who I'll come back to shortly as well. Now that strike lasted about 6 or 7 years. They walked from the station down to one of their outstations, but that also led to a lot of correspondence with parliamentarians in other states and territories to say this is just not fair. We have no rights to our homelands, we have no rights to be counted. And what that walk-off did is really spur on people saying, well, what can we do here? Like, how can we actually help? Which then led to, in part, that movement to the 1967 referendum. Maybe some of you were here in 1967, where there was a referendum to change the Constitution. The Constitution has a very, which I carry with me all the time, as I do as a good lawyer, the Constitution has a list of powers that the Commonwealth Government can make laws about. And previously, it had one law about, has my Roman numerals here, 26, that said they could make powers for the people of any race other than the Aboriginal race in any state for whom it was deemed necessary to make special laws. So in my copy of the Constitution, those words are now struck out because the 1967 referendum asked for 2 changes to the Constitution, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples could be counted as part of the population, and the Commonwealth would be able to make laws for them. So until then, until 1967, there was no power to count them as people in our country, flora and fauna mainly, and that there was no power to make laws. Now, interesting for 2023, that 1967 referendum was passed, 97% of people voted yes. So there was, I obviously wasn't there, but if there were people here, there was a groundswell of public support, public sentiment to say this is the right thing to do. So that's the first big legal change. So we saw the petition and the walk-off, which was more civil unrest and people trying to do that in acting as members of the community. That was the first time we saw a legal change from the Parliament, given that the referendum was passed and the Constitution was changed. There were then, that at least makes recognition of being counted in the census and having laws, but there's still no recognition of rights to land or rights to participate in culture and heritage. And so, still back in the Northern Territory in the 70s, there was a great case, again, of the East Arnhem Land people, the Yolngu people of Milliripan and Nabalco, where the Yolngu people took an action in the federal court to say there must be a way that the common law that we inherited from England could recognise us as First Nations, and that we had a pre-existing series of laws, we had a pre-existing culture. And the federal court, Justice Woodward in that case, went through all of the analysis about how Australia was colonised, how our laws work, and he basically said, I'm sorry, I just can't find a way to do that. There is nothing in the laws of Australia that lets me recognise a pre-existing community of First Nations people. I'm sorry, but that's the law and that's the way these things work. But there was a Royal Commission held after that, and then you're getting just into the Whitlam time, the sort of the mid-70s reformation of Gough Whitlam sort of era, and because the court process failed in recognising, the Parliament then said, okay, we'll do something about that. And the Whitlam government then passed some Aboriginal land rights legislation in the Northern Territory, which said, if the courts can't recognise it, we can do that. And so if there is land in the Northern Territory that we can hand back, and we can recognise that you've got rights, we will do so. And you get that great photo of Gough Whitlam and Vincent Lingari, and Gough's passing the sand back through Vincent's hand and handing back the title deeds to some of the traditional land up there. There was also in that Whitlam government the Racial Discrimination Act, which was for the first time a piece of law that said, actually, we can't discriminate on the basis of race. Before then you could, so you could make laws that were quite discriminatory. In 1975 you also had the Racial Discrimination Act, which is quite relevant when we fast forward a couple of years. So we've gone through civil petitions, we've gone through that failed, court cases that failed. You've got some government intervention in legislation, but really only in the Northern Territory. That didn't apply to other states around Australia. And then some piece of legislation about racial discrimination. We had to then fast forward to the 80s. There's where we then come across the Mabo cases, which just really fundamentally changed the common law and the way that we see this. And I'm sure most people here will remember that. There's a great anecdote of a legal conference being held in James Cook University where a number of eminent lawyers and barristers were meeting to talk about whether it would be possible to run a case, a test case about native title. And they were talking amongst themselves, so if only we could try to show that the way people think about the common law and the rights that we all have under the common law has a very similar analogy to the way Aboriginal people live. And by that they meant things like property boundaries, things like succession laws, you know, when you pass away that there's a system of laws that you might have, pass it through to sons and daughters. Things like the ability to determine disputes. And a gardener up at James Cook University overheard this and said, well, actually, I live on Murray Island, and we do that. We have cans of stones where we mark out our boundaries of our property. We have a patrilineal succession law, so our properties get passed down from father to son. And those things came together, and the gardener was Eddie Marbo, and they decided, okay, we're going to start a test case to see if this actually works. Can we get something that we now call native title fitting into the common law of Australia? You see there's two cases there. As this was being thought of, we were now in the Joh Bjelke-Petersen era in Queensland, and Joh's Parliament said they'd heard that there might be this case, so they tried to pass a law that was called the Coastal Declaratory Act of 1988 that said even if native title exists, we're denying it and we are wiping it out and cancelling it as of right. Thankfully, the way the Constitution works, we had a Commonwealth Racial Discrimination Act which trumps any state-based legislation, so I had to go through a first case of Mabo number 1 to say that that piece of law was unconstitutional, as it was, and then it took another 4 years for the Mabo case to go through the various federal court up to the High Court, where you have, and I'm sure everyone remembers it because it was all over the papers, finally the High Court, so the highest court of our land, that said, you know, as long as an Aboriginal group could show continued connection to their land, a pre-existing set of laws, customs, and that they adhere to those laws and those customs now, and it hasn't been broken by government action, then yes, the common law could recognise what we now call native title. They also nicely said that the concept of terra nullius, the land belonged to no one, was just an absolute folly and an incorrect statement and should have never been made. So there were people legitimately living here before colonisation. Their rights can be recognised, but their rights can also be extinguished and be taken away. So post that, the more conservative press would have scared the pants off people about losing their backyards and the like. All of that's false. The government can grant you freehold land that's inconsistent with continued native title, so that extinguishes native title. So now you've got a lot of areas in Australia where native title doesn't exist because of actions of the government, like building public works, like having reserves like churches on reserve land, roads, people's houses and the like. But there are many parts of the country where Aboriginal groups still have a strong connection to their land and their culture, and they can claim through a federal court process to have their native title recognised and describe what those native title rights and interests. So that takes us all the way to the 90s, and really that fundamentally changed how we consider First Nations people from a legal perspective, purely from a legal perspective. There are many cases after that that led, and I deal with these sort of day in and day out. But most of that is a legal reaction. Groups still have to take action. They have to, it's expensive court cases and the like. In the sort of mid-2000s, 2010s, there was a movement then called to recognise, where people thought what we would really like to do is try to have some sort of further fundamental change where perhaps we could be recognised as First Nations people in the rule book of Australia, in the Constitution, which doesn't, apart from removing that right, doesn't mention Aboriginal people much at all. And what I'm going to talk about next then is setting that historical context to show this is just a continuing conversation of First Nations groups with non-First Nations groups in Australia. Two fundamental things have then happened. Firstly, the Uluru Statement of the Heart. I'll show you some pickies first. You've got the Bark Petition, you've got the Wave Hill Walk-Off, you've got the 1967 referendum, you've got the land rights movement, there's still the Aboriginal Embassy in Canberra, you've got Eddie Marbo and his legal team, and that was the time of the Marbo decision. That ended up being the Native Title Act. So they're very famous photos from Australian history. But I'm just going to fast forward now from 92 to 2017. And to understand the referendum question, you first need to understand the Uluru Statement from the Heart, where hundreds of Aboriginal people representing their home communities met in the shadow of Uluru to talk about how they could actually change the conversation. And there is this most beautiful and poetic statement. You can't read it there, but that's what it looks like. It's quite large. I just recommend everyone go home and Google it to read it. It's poetic in its language. It's an invitation from Aboriginal people to say, can you, and I'll paraphrase this, stop doing things for us. Could you stop and listen to us and walk with us, please? And it talks about colonisation. It talks about disenfranchisement and lack of and loss of connection, but it also offers some hope for the future and suggests three things that the people who sign this, over 250 Aboriginal groups, suggest would help if people so chose to follow down that path. And there are three key things that the Uluru Statement from the Heart shares with the rest of the non-Indigenous community. And they are voice, treaty and truth. So what we're mainly talking about today is voice, but I'll touch on treaty and truth as well. So the voice was a request in the Uluru Statement of the Heart to have the First Nations voice guaranteed by the Constitution. That's quite important. There's been a lot of other discussions about why can't you just pass laws or why can't you just have like a subcommittee. But the Uluru Statement of the Heart is the source of where the request to have this enshrined in the Constitution comes from. So it's a voice to Parliament to provide a permanent platform for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders for their voices to be heard by Parliament. I'll come to what all those words mean soon. And in the material that the Voice Secretariat have released, it talks about a role to amplify the voice of First Nations, as again enshrined in the Constitution. You can see there the actual Uluru Statement of the Heart and the size of it. It's quite a beautiful piece of art as well as an important historical document. So we'll come back to the voice in a minute because that's what we're going to talk about as a country in a couple of weeks' time. It also calls for treaty, which and there's a thought to set up a commission in Yolngu language, a Makarrata commission, which is a language that means coming together. There is a hope to have some sort of treaty commission set up to say, well, would it be possible for treaties to be formed with either the wider Aboriginal population or individual Aboriginal groups? We are one of the few Commonwealth nations that doesn't have a treaty with their First Nations peoples. If you look to New Zealand with the Treaty of Waitangi, you look to Canada with numerous treaties formed around the 1800s. We just never did that. Our colonisation process was a bit more harsh and a bit more hard and fast. And the response from the First Nations groups in Australia was a different one to the response that you would have seen in New Zealand or in Canada. So we don't have a treaty, and that's not like a contract to sign things away. That's just a recognition of two sovereign nations working out the way that they react with each other. So there might be still a process of treaty making, but again, even that's not a new process. I know they're little words there, but I'll just tell you what that says. In every state, just about every state and territory at the moment for the past 5 years, there's been good steps to have state-based treaties with Aboriginal groups. In Queensland, we've got a Path to Treaty bill that was passed earlier this year, and they've already set up a First Nations Treaty Institute to talk about what the scaffolding and what the framework might be. Victoria has a Treaty Authority and Other Treaty Elements bill. South Australia has an Indigenous Voice to Parliament already, has something very similar to what we're going to be voting for, and also well along the way of that. There's no great process in WA yet, although they've actually entered into large-scale agreements with Indigenous people around the southwest, which are treaties by other names. And there's active progression in Northern Territory, ACT. Tasmania says they're studying it. So the Uluru Statement of the Heart talks about some sort of treaty process from a Commonwealth perspective, but it's already happening on just about every state and territory's perspective as well. The third thing that the Uluru Statement from the Heart talks to is, let's say, truth. And again, this commission, you see there the Makarrata Commission, in Yolngu language, they're coming together after a struggle, that's what it means, is to sort of try to capture the aspirations of Indigenous people to try to record a slightly different version, slightly different version of history, to actually try to record what did happen throughout the colonial era. And again, this isn't a particularly groundbreaking thing. You'll have seen these sorts of truth commissions in post-apartheid South Africa, where there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there in Canada and South Australia, more just to record for prosperity and so that we've set the tone right for the future, and to articulate what reconciliation might look like, to articulate the actual history of Australia from an Aboriginal voice. So those are the two extra things that might happen afterwards. So voice, treaty, truth. So if people ask you, well, where is this heading? First off the rank is voice, which we'll get back to now. There's young Albo. He's looking very happy with himself because this is 2 minutes after he realised he'd won the last election. And the very second thing he said after, gee, wow, I won, was, I commit to the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full. We can answer its patient, gracious call for a voice enshrined in our Constitution, because all of us ought to be proud that amongst us and our great multicultural society, we count the oldest living continuous culture in the world. So that's the second thing he said on election night, and this, I'm sure you've seen from the papers, this has been very high on the political agenda since then, and that's why we're all going to the polls in October. So what is the voice, you might ask me? So first dot point, which says it's something that's requested from the Uluru Statement. Second dot point is more the focus, the what is it, to give us, for Indigenous Australians, a greater say in decisions that affect them. Who? People always say, well, who is going to be on this voice? There'll be a process where it'll be comprised of a group of selected Indigenous Australians from regional communities, which will be able to consult Parliament and Government. And the enshrinement part about the Constitution is the key bit, which I'll come to in a minute when we talk about the referendum. So the voice will be constitutionally enshrined and will ensure that Aboriginal people have a say in policies that affect them. It's really not much more complicated than that. We do have to go to a referendum, though, to have the Constitution change, and it's one of the very fail-safe mechanisms in our Constitution. Just so parliaments, rogue parliaments can't come in and just change the Constitution willy-nilly, you need to hold a referendum. And there have been very few referendums in my lifetime. I think the last one we had dealt with the Republic, and that was a particularly badly drafted referendum question, so it failed, but also from the sentiment of the population at the time. But for those that don't know their constitutional law, a referendum will only pass if you get a majority of people in a majority of states, saying yes to the particular question that's being asked for them. So unlike a normal election where it's first past the post and preferential voting, because we're a federation and in 1901 we all came together to form a constitution, we have to have the majority of people in Queensland and 4 or 5 other states to actually have the yes vote recorded. If they don't get that, then the no vote is recorded. As I said, the Constitution sets out our laws, and it's the fundamental thing. The referendum is the only way to do it, and Sixth Federation, only 8 referendums out of 44 proposals have been approved. Some referendums have multiple questions. I think the 1967 referendum had multiple questions as well. One of them just happened to be the Aboriginal issue. So you've got some stuff in your letterbox, I'm sure, and you're seeing all the ads. You get, everyone gets a ballot paper. The question that's posed is on it, and then you can vote yes or no. History will show, even if we ignore the content of what this referendum is about, the simpler the question, the more likely it is that people can understand it and will vote yes. If questions are particularly complicated, there's been some referendums about changing the timing of Senate elections and how senators can go through half terms and full terms. I don't even understand that. So it's always voted no. It's just too hard to work out. That's probably why you'll see there's been so much effort and so much time taken into this question, which is both a positive but also a negative depending on which camp you're in. But the question you're going to be asked to look at is this: a proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? That's it. So if people around you say, I don't know what the detail is, I don't know what we're being asked to do, that's what you're being asked to do. A one-sentence question to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. And I think the papers have already shown you like what the ballot paper might look like. Down the bottom is a box. You write yes or no. That's the simple way to do it. So I think from the yes vote camp, simplicity is the key there. From the no vote camp, obviously people are trying to say, oh, what's hidden behind all of these words? I still think history will show that the simpler the question, the more likely it is that people will really, grasp it and understand what's going on. If the yes vote is successful, these are the words that will be put into the Constitution. Currently, the Constitution has 128 sections. Section 128 talks about how to alter the Constitution and the referendums. So we will then have a new section 129. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because this is, I think, the bit that people need to understand the most. We're going to have a new chapter in the Constitution. So there's chapters in the Constitution about formation of courts, formation of Parliament, how elections are run. At the end, we'll have a new chapter 9, which is headed, and as a lawyer, every word's important, so I'm going to sort of focus on each word here. Recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So even that, I think it's quite a simple and quite factual-based sentence to put in the Constitution. If we vote yes, we're going to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So I'll just leave that one there. Then we're going to have a heading, which says Section 129, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. So that's just self-evident. So 3 key sections, 3 sections which are quite important. Number 1, there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. So that law allows the Commonwealth Parliament, as it currently sits, to form a new body called the voice. That's all that line allows them to do. So the same way that they, back in the 1800s, might have formed what is now the Commonwealth Bank, or they will have formed the Federal Court, the Constitution will let the Commonwealth Parliament form this body called the voice. Nothing else so far. What can the voice do is the next obvious question, and Section 2 of Section 129 answers that. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So the really important words there, after Section 1 we've got a voice set up. When it is set up, that voice may make representations. So people, if I hear about what's happening across the airwaves and in the Murdoch Press and Sky News, there's commentary about this voice making laws, this voice causing change, this voice denying people's rights. The only thing that this voice will be able to do is make representations to the Parliament and Executive Government. Now, representations legally means if I want your opinion on something, I'd ask you to make a representation to me. If Angela and I were thinking about having fish and chips for dinner tonight, and we asked our boys, actually, what do you feel like it? And they say pizza, they're making a representation to me. I'm still paying for it, so I can make up my own mind, but I thank you for your opinion. Okay? So this does not give the voice a right of veto. Let's say there's a new law that's set up to protect the environment more, or there's a new law about taxes or the like. The Parliament and the Executive Government, so that's the departments and the people that make the laws and policies, can knock on the door of the voice and say, we've got this new law, we'd like to understand from your perspective and from your regional-based communities how this might impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I think that's a really clear, a really important thing to understand. It's what's not said there that I think people need to understand. It's not a right of veto. It's not a new court. It's not a third chamber of Parliament. The law, as it says there, is that they can make representations. Now, again, people might think, oh, this is new. It's very similar to, in Queensland and Victoria, we have a Human Rights Act, which is, they're quite new, probably 3 or 4 years old. And in Queensland, the Human Rights Act says that any politician, any government department, before they pass a law, they need to take into account this list of human rights. The right to practice religion, the right to practice culture, the right to fair wages, the right to safety at work, the right to not being discriminated. And if you're going to pass a law, you have to run this filter through to say, well, does this new piece of law impact on human rights? And they do a human rights impact statement that goes with the bill to Parliament to show that they've done this. It's a very similar process. And the Victorian government has something similar as well. So I can only stress that enough about it's not, there's no ability for this new voice to run its own game. It's there for a purpose, to give advice. And there are 1,000 advisory bodies that the government spends money on left, right and centre that already exist. This one just happens to be focused on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and because it was requested in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, it's sought to be enshrined in the Constitution. Now, the third bit, which is the bit about show me the details, I don't know, so I'm voting no sort of concept, is, well, how is this thing going to be set up? What's going to do? Who's going to be it? So, on it, sorry. So 3 says the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, including composition, functions, powers and procedures. Now, I'll unlawyer that. It means that there are no new laws that are existing, but whatever the Parliament can already do under the Constitution, it must follow. So it can't create a whole new kangaroo court, or can't create a whole new process of powers for this voice, but it has to still comply with the Constitution. It'll need to pass a new federal act, so there'll be a bill to Parliament called the VOICE, and in that it will set out how many people will be on it, where they will come from, if there's some sort of democratic voting process amongst Aboriginal people about how they will be there, how that works, the term of people being on it, the powers, the procedures, if they get paid, if they don't get paid, holidays, that sort of thing. So it's a very similar and very well-trodden path for any government authority, tribunal, government-owned corporation, even similar to things, subcommittees that our diocese would set up. So the key part there, if you're asking, well, what will this do? Well, it will do what the Parliament asks it to do when it actually passes a law that sets out all of the details. And that's quite important as well. Now, I'll sort of stand and argue against myself here on this side. People may say, well, I need more details about that. I'd like to see exactly what the legislation looked like so I could be sure about who is on this, where do they come from. And if I argue over here, I'll say, well, I think whoever our current politician is here for this electorate, people would have voted for him or her. You don't know what laws they were going to pass in the Parliament going forward. They might have had a platform about workers or safety or health, but you never have seen the legislation before you go to a general election. So it's very similar to that. At least here you've got direction about these 3 sections, what they're going to do, setting up this body called the VOICE, what the VOICE can do, it can make representations, and I want to sort of add there what it can't do, because you can only have powers in what the law says. It doesn't say, and it can tell parliamentarians what to do, it can't veto pieces of legislation, it can't introduce pieces of legislation into the Parliament, it can't run court cases, to advance its own directives. It just is there to be listened to as part of a consultation process. And then, like all good authorities, tribunals, departments, there will be a piece of legislation that we'll all see that says this is the makeup, these are their powers, their procedures, and their functions. That piece of law perhaps can be changed, like most laws in the future. But if this is enshrined in the Constitution about the actual makeup of the VOICE, then it can only be undone by another referendum. And I'll probably finish and go to questions soon, but why that's so critical to the people that want the Uluru Statement of the Heart to be responded to is because if I go back and have another sort of history lesson, I can show you time and time again where Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander bodies, committees have been set up by one colour of government, disbanded by the next colour of government, reintroduced and disbanded, etc., etc., etc. Huge waste and very ineffective. So if we take the essence of walking with Aboriginal people as invited in the Uluru Statement of the Heart, we'll hear that call, and that call says we'd like to have some recognition of First Nations in the Constitution, so we get that in that title. We'd like to have a voice that would ask us how things might look, how new laws might affect Indigenous people. There is a myriad of good, demonstrable statistics that Indigenous-led responses to Indigenous issues have a far greater impact to Indigenous communities than non-Indigenous-led responses. So I think that sort of is a good point to make. And then if the Parliament does set this voice up and is there to make representations, quite happy that the law will come that says how it's made up, who it's made up of, etc., etc., etc. And that's it. It's not that complicated, despite all of the static that's out there. But really happy to take some questions, and I know that's a lot of information to digest, but happy to talk or unpack any parts of that that may not be clear.
So with the voice,
Sorry, ma'am.
is altering the constitution the only way for it to occur essentially? Because you spoke about different bodies,
Yep.
but there are lots of bodies. Why is this body needing for it to be a constitutional change?
Yeah, it's a good question. A similar thing could be set up by the Parliament passing a law, but as I said, every time that there has been some form of Aboriginal Torres Strait Island Commission, like ATSIC, or previously the Aboriginal Development Society, I think, if it falls foul of the next government that comes in, it's defunded and abolished. So the only answer to that question is that it's to be enshrined in the Constitution because the Aboriginal communities through the Uluru Statement have asked for it to be enshrined in the Constitution.
Certainly, that was my next
That's it.
question. It wasn't anything other than
No. It's got nothing. It's basically all comes from that 2017 proclamation that said, here is one other way to think about the future, as opposed to the non-Indigenous parliaments, policymakers saying, here's some really good ideas for you, which we can all see have failed. Could we pivot? And no one's saying this is going to absolutely work, but could we pivot and say, why don't you listen to us first? And the best way to have a long-term, longitudinal listening process is to set this up and have it so that it can't be tinkered with by having it in the Constitution. Sorry, there was a fellow just back here. Detail about how people will be replaced and appointed will be in that section 3 for their powers. But a good analogy is that the Constitution sets up our judicial system, our High Court. So the Parliament can like or dislike the judges, the independent judges of the High Court. You know, we have the separation of powers sort of process under the Westminster system. But there's no way that the Parliament can disband the High Court as a concept. It can wait till people retire. If someone does something bad, when's the last time that's happened? Justice Vasta in the Queensland Supreme Court, then there are powers to remove such people. But that doesn't impact on the body itself. So the workings will be apparent. There will be some co-design process about what that looks like, and you'll see that in the legislation that comes through. But the key point is that if whatever flavour government comes in next that doesn't care for the people on the voice, well, that might be too bad. But all the people on the voice can do is make representations to them anyway. Those representations don't need to be listened to, but there is a hope, obviously, that that will form a better process for developing laws and policies that relate to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
So if the referendum passes Chapter 9, we'll go straight into the Constitution. Number 3 within Chapter 9 could then take a bit of time to sort out. So it's not like...
No, that's right.
Would there be then some sort of limit on how much back and forth that will go so they can get
My read of the tea leaves is that will be moved on fairly quickly because the people of Australia will have spoken, and we don't have and it should be done in this election cycle. You wouldn't wait till post the next Commonwealth election. People of Australia will have voted yes, and so there's no need for any of the other sides to argue because the detail is there, the law is there, and they'll just have to pass a bill, which will be a pretty administrative and boring piece of legislation. Yeah.
How does it actually change what happens at the grassroots level?
Yep. And I probably should have prefaced this being, I'm obviously a white lawyer and snappily dressed, I know, but that's my perspective. So I can report back from what I'm hearing from people like Professor Marshall Langton, Noel Pearson and the like. They do see that not the trickle down, that raising up effect, and that's where the hope is. It revolves around, the better use of our taxpayer dollars, the better policy directive, the better running of local programs for local issues. Now they're all, again, big sort of, buzzwords and the like, but that's where the hope is, that people, as I said, there is, if you look at some of the websites for the yes vote, there is some really good research done about the outcomes that are achieved from Indigenous-led, on the ground, on country, local community solutions to homelessness, domestic violence, alcoholism and the like, as opposed to the more big brother Canberra mentality of this is a good idea, we'll run it out across the country. Now that, we're always looking for these sort of simple problems for complex solutions, but I think where this should head is complex solutions to complex problems as well, and having a look at what is happening in individual communities, what the needs are of communities, and allocating better, certainly getting better direction from the policymakers, which should then lead to better use of taxpayer resources, which should lead to better outcomes. But apart from that, it's let's take the first step and see. Or the opposite of it is, can't just keep banging our head against the desk and thinking things are going to change. I think that's probably that pivot. And because we've been invited to actually think in a different way by Aboriginal people themselves, as opposed to a particular political party saying this is our new Indigenous affairs policy and isn't it shiny and better than the last Indigenous affairs policy, I think that's the key difference here, that we're being invited to take these steps. Sir?
In regard to your previous answer to that lady's question, that the enshrining in the Constitution, you basically said that this is to stop other parliaments coming along and changing it all.
Yes.
But in essence, what is proposed can be done by the Parliament, according to David Jackson.
Yes,
anyway,
correct.
Who is a constitutional.
He is.
That there's no need for this to be put in the Constitution because they have the powers under the Constitution to do all the things that you set out there. Is that correct?
You are absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct. And then the next thing you'd probably want to ask is, well, why are we looking to enshrine it in the Constitution? and that's because of the invitation through the Uluru Statement from the Heart.
So basically it's a question of power. If they get that power, then it's there forever.
I wouldn't put it as a power because, as I've said, the duties of the voice is to make representations, so they don't have any great powers to do anything. They've got powers to respond to requests from Parliament and executive government about things that might impact them. The flip side of, and I've read David's advices thoroughly, and he's 100% correct. It doesn't then take that next step to be wary of the next form of government that says we don't like this, and and think of, and we're amending that bill or deleting that bill. So it's the pure reason.
But this will not allow that to occur because it's enshrined.
That's right.
Whereas up till now in Australia, if any law is not liked by the people, and the people then put another government in, then they can sort of take it out. Either bad law or a law that's not liked by the people.
That's right. And that's,
So that's democratic thing.
yeah, it's the beauty of democracy. And in a couple of weeks' time, you'll get to say, do you like this law or not? That's the whole, and you get to write why yes or no. Very much so. At the back. Well said. No, that's fine, thank you. Well, thank you for listening. I appreciate it. Question, another question here?
Given the work that you do in your field, there's been decades between things being then that sort of done in the 70s, but that was probably part of other movements.
Yes.
Discrimination. Torres Strait Islanders. Arvo was in the 80s, and it's now taken us all this time to get to. Given, what your experience, if this is a no, then how far back, is it another than 2 decades before we get back out?
Yeah. I'll answer that in two ways. If we just think about how politicians in Australia from any flavour look at the world, it's election cycle to election cycle, and having worked in this space in a state and federal level and spoken, been in front of many ministers, there's 97% of the population is not Indigenous, and when they vote in general elections, there's not many votes in things like this generally. There is you'll see all of there's votes in rental subsidies and welfare and good development projects and the like. So from just a pure perspective of, well, what do we want to be out there talking to the punters on the hustings about, this isn't necessarily one of them. If there is a no vote, we still have the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and my gut feeling would be that we would see a greater momentum into the treaty-based sort of process, because that's the second good call from that. And I don't think that the Parliament will shy away from that. And in fact, that's quote from the Prime Minister said that we will be trying to look at all of the Uluru Statement of Heart and embedding all of that. So that, yes, it might be a step backward or two, but I think this momentum, certainly from the communities I've been around, is still flowing. Ma'am.
Closing the gap. We hear a great deal about closing the gap. So obviously, my thinking is the very long way. We're not doing very, very good. We're not doing very well at closing the gap, going as we are. Obviously, I think that this is a step.
Look, I'm not a social scientist or a policy maker, but I can say that, for what I've seen, we we whitefellas have a great ability to tell people that we know a lot better than them, and these things will be good for you, and I think that's failed time and time again. We also think that the things that we hold dear are homogenous across all levels of society, and that isn't necessarily true from even a First Nations perspective or a multicultural perspective or a immigrant perspective. So I think that this gives us some pause to step back and say, yeah, actually, we will try to stop being so proactive, and we'd really invite, we'll keep our mouths closed for a while our ears are open, and hopefully listen to Aboriginal communities about things like health, education, literacy, domestic violence and alcoholism, and ask for direction as to what they would find more useful than what has happened in the past, which has caused those gaps.
Yeah, so my understanding is what the gaps are. It's a result of the census determining this is what's happening in the general population.
Yes.
This is what's happening in the Aboriginal
Yes.
population. And there's a huge divide.
That's right. Things like life expectancy.
The government's been throwing an enormous amount of money into these things to try and close the gap.
Yes.
To bring the Aboriginal people up to the general population. And it's failed.
Yes.
And it's failing. And you're saying it's because these are white-led solutions rather than the Aboriginal people developing their own solutions.
That's correct. Yeah. And that's the hope. That's the hope, yeah. And we'd like to see if that happened, it actually worked. But we've got to start this journey somewhere. Jack.
I'm a new Australian. I came to Australia in 1962. To this not home country. What the missionaries told me in Surrey. Little did I know Australia had a black history. Worse still. Such uncharitable
Thank you. It's like, I feel like Q&A. I'll take that as a comment. Thank you. There's lots of cake up the back. We're happy. But has everyone got any last questions? One, yes? Yeah, for sure. I've been doing this about 3 or 4 times a week for the past 4 weeks now. For clients, for major companies, for local community groups, but absolutely, I'll turn up anytime, anywhere to talk about this, because I think I really want people to KNOW. That's the most important bit. Okay. Mm-hmm.
So, well, did you set up the same possibility?
Absolutely, we'll work on it. We've got plenty of spare time.
Certainly, I'm sure we could, there's some friends of ours who we could bring along.
Yeah.
I'm sure many other people, maybe people who've got doubts as well.
Sure. We'll make it happen. Thank you for the suggestion. Last call before cup of tea? Sold.
Yes.